For dozens of years, the arts have been found as an outlet to express one's emotions. Specifically during the many years African Americans were slaves in the 1800s, making music was their only escape from mental freedom. Although they were later granted physical freedom, African Americans still felt trapped in society due to the hatred surrounding them. Instead of the African Americans using the arts to ease the oppression, the arts were used against them, causing oppression. During a large portion of the 20th century, minstrel shows were enjoyed and popular among white people. Minstrel shows are the mocking of African Americans using song and dance, portrayed by whites often dressed as slaves and in blackface. As significantly, during the early 1900s, whites were the only people who gained the opportunity of stardom in the arts and entertainment business. However, many years later, special black individuals changed the industry completely.
One person who sparked this change was Hattie McDaniel, the first African American to win an Oscar and sing on the radio. On June 10, 1895, McDaniel was born to two former slaves, Susan and Henry, in Wichita, Kansas. Even though the McDaniel family suffered extensive poverty and starvation, Hattie raised money for her family through singing and dancing. After singing through school plays and musicals until her sophomore year of high school, McDaniel decided to drop out of school to live out her dream of becoming a singer. Traveling in an all-innovative female black minstrel group, Hattie's role as a groundbreaker started. In the early 1900s, McDaniel joined an all-African-American jazz group called the Melody Hounds. Although it seemed like her life was becoming incredible, Mrs. McDaniel's husband, George Langford, was brutally killed by gunshot. As McDaniel was grieving her husband's death, her singing career flourished, as she was the first African-American to sing on the radio, where she sang an original song, I Thought I'd Do It. After hearing her glorious voice, Paramount Records in Chicago signed her to an individual record label. Although it seemed like the only way Miss McDaniel could go was up, when the Great Depression hit, she lost her job and was facing starvation and deprivation. After working as a bathroom attendant and waitress in Club Madrid in a Milwaukee roadhouse, she decided to move out to Hollywood with her brother Sam and her sisters Ed and Orlena in 1930. Only a year later, McDaniels landed a role as Aunt Frida in Are You Listening? Although this wasn't the main role, it led Hattie onto her path of becoming a film star. Between 1931 and 1939, Miss McDaniel appeared in approximately 72 films. 9 years later, Miss McDaniel was cast to the role of a lifetime, Mammy in Gone with the Wind. Due to her amazing acting skills, she won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. This was the first Academy Award given to an African American. Although
where are you going without your shawl and the night air fixing to set in? And how come you didn't ask them gentlemen to stay for supper? You ain't got no more manners than a field hand. That's to me and Miss Helen done language with you. Miss Scarlett, come on in the house. Come on in before you catch your death of dampness.
No, I'm going to wait for Pa to come home from the Wilkses.
Come on in here. Come on.
Although her role in Gone with the Wind was impressive and memorable, she was forced to sit in the back table at the Oscars with her fellow African-American actors. Not only was Hattie McDaniel an inspirer in the arts business, she always became a leader for those around her. In 1945, McDaniel and 31 other black residents were sued from their neighborhood from their white neighbors and hoped to kick them out. Not letting racism affect her life, she gathered a group of 200 people to argue in the trial. Not only did they win their case, the points she brought up explaining the racist acts in the country led to a revolutionary case in the Supreme Court. Years later, after being diagnosed with breast cancer, Hattie died a peaceful death at the Motion Picture and Television County House and Hospital. Although Hattie lived a short life, the impact she made in 57 years will last decades.
Another talented African-American woman who changed civil rights for the better is actor and singer Lena Horne. Lena Horne was born on June 30th, 1917, in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn. She lived there until her parents got divorced at age 3. Horne lived with her grandparents for several years until her mother took her and traveled to the South in search of a job. Throughout her teenage years, Horne used singing as a way to escape the racial barriers set for her. Almost since the beginning of her career, Horne did not consider herself black. She thought of herself as a dark white, making it easier for people to accept her. However, this all changed when she started working at Cafe Society downtown, where she started talking to Paul Robeson, who taught her about black politics, culture, and history. Through talking to Robeson, Horn started to realize that she could play a bigger role in the civil rights movement. From then on, Horn became more involved in civil rights. For example, she participated in meetings with blacks after violence in Birmingham and started singing at civil rights rallies. In 1942, Horn signed a contract with MGM. She was the first black woman since 1915 to sign a long-term contract with the film studio. Later in 1944, she became the first African American to appear on the cover of a movie magazine. By the late 1950s, Horn starred in the Broadway musical Jamaica. Throughout her career, Horn refused to play maids or other stereotypical black roles. Additionally, when she was unable to stay in the hotel she performed at, Horn developed a toughness as a way of isolating herself from the audience. Later in her career, the hotel she performed at asked her to find some place to sleep in the black parts of town, and she would refuse. Lena Horne paved the path to the acceptance of colored people in the arts and entertainment business. Although Lena Horne herself learned to love her race, many white Americans, specifically Southerners, hoped for the arts and entertainment industry to stay the same when African Americans didn't express their heritage. As a way to receive the first-hand outlook of how the white Southerners reacted, we interviewed Miss Rossler, who grew up in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement.
So in the 60s, there were many black artists just starting, particularly in the music business, right? And so there were kids who were my age who loved loved their work, like Aretha Franklin. I mean, she was, even though I lived in Mississippi, people were very excited about what she was doing. But it wasn't everybody. So, I had friends whose parents came from a different time and who did not appreciate the success. And my friend's mother would not let her buy records that were performed by black artists. So it ran the gamut. Okay. My personal initial reactions were that they were great movies, but I'm Jewish, and we had a Jewish community in Jackson, Mississippi, and we all probably shared pretty close outlooks about civil rights. And so for me and for our community, it was a great thing. Although we were in a very small minority, so most of my friends were non-Jewish, but any enlightened people or any people that I was friendly with shared my views for the most part. So I really never heard anybody that was my contemporary that would say anything negative about those movies. I'm sure that some of their parents were probably not as open to it. The only person I knew was my friend's mom, who it's an interesting thing because she was a deeply religious person, and was, if you met her, you would think she was just, and she was very sweet and welcoming to people as long as their skin was white. She and others of her background and generation were brought up to think that people with who had different colored skin were not appropriate to socialize with, nor were they, smart enough and shouldn't enjoy the successes of the world, particularly if they weren't. It didn't really affect my neighborhood per se. I mean, and sparking conversations in my world, not really. But again, I'm sure that it did for other people who had different outlooks than myself and my friends and my family.
What did you feel was the difference between the white and the African American songs?
Probably a lot of soul. In Mississippi, it was that was like the blues were really created in the South, particularly like in the Delta of Mississippi, and it was all about black people and their lives and sometimes I guess their difficulties or whatever, and you could hear it in the music, which many people appreciated and loved. But again, it would depend on your outlook. If you were from a very closed-minded family or background that didn't want to see the success of black people at all, of course you didn't want them to do well, and so you really probably wouldn't be so happy about their music. But it was appreciated in my circle. It was very much.
As the years went on, people became more accepting of blacks receiving the spotlight, which allowed young, talented black people to make a difference in society by splitting the color barrier in arts and entertainment. Actor, director, and author Sidney Poitier contributed to the beginning of the break of the color barrier in Hollywood because he always acted with integrity and intelligence when portraying a character. In fact, because of his outstanding performances, Poitier won an Academy Award for acting in Lilies of the Field in 1964, making him the first African American to achieve this award. Sidney Poitier was born on February 20th, 1927 to a Bahamian couple. He grew up on Cat Island, Bahamas for a portion of his childhood. After a couple years, Poitier moved to Miami to live with one of his 7 brothers, Cyril. Poitier's life in Miami was frustrating because the U.S. city was filled with racism towards the blacks and the financial struggle always remained a challenge. Since his teenage years were filled with hatred and poverty, he felt a constant loneliness. Poitier made it onto the big screen in 1950 in No Way Out, playing Dr. Luther Brooks, the black doctor who is forced to endure the racism of his patient, however still acts with dignity. After appearing in No Way Out, Poitier acted in dozens of other movies which defied racial stereotypes, like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. This movie portrayed love in an interracial relationship, helping to shape new perspectives of interracial relationships. In general, the many roles he portrayed allowed white Americans to think differently of black people because Poitier played his characters in a caring and respectable manner.
Down before you fall down, I mean.
He thinks you're gonna faint because he's a Negro.
Well, I don't think I'm going to faint. But I'll sit down anyway.
As well as Sidney Poitier, his close friend with similar experience used his fame to benefit the evolvement of civil rights. A very successful artist, Harry Belafonte was born on March 1st, 1927 in Harlem, New York. Harry grew up with his 2 brothers and his mother because his father left their family when Harry was very young. His family fought through poverty, ultimately forcing them to move to his mother's native land, Jamaica, when he was 8. 5 years later, his family moved back to Harlem when Harry was 13. Harry struggled a lot as a child, calling it the worst part of his life. His mother was hardly ever with him because she had to work so much, and he was almost always being cared for by other people. In 1944, when Harry was in high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served during World War II. When Harry returned to New York after he was discharged, he was able to use the money he got from being in the military to study drama at a new school in Manhattan, along with his good friend Sidney Poitier. Harry had his first live performance at the Village Vanguard Jazz Club alongside guitarist Millard Thomas. Harry also had a career in acting, and he won a Tony Award in 1954 for a great performance in the show John Murray Anderson's Almanac. In 1956, he released his first album titled Belafonte, which reached number 1 on the charts and stayed there for 31 weeks. Harry Belafonte's music started a national craze for calypso music, a type of folk. Harry's success did not slow down at all. In fact, at the turn of the 60s, he became the first black producer and also won an Emmy Award. In 1964, Harry's fame started to lessen due to new young stars rising. He was not very popular during the 70s, and he spent most of the 70s and 80s as a civil rights activist. Belafonte funded and participated in many rallies and strikes. He did fundraiser concerts, even one for MLK's bail. Belafonte is no longer the big star that he used to be, but he's still active as an artist to keep his name known to the public.
Thanks to these 4 brave, talented artists, African Americans were able to shine in the entertainment business for years to come.